All right, ladies and gentlemen. So we have spent a lot of time over this little quarantine period talking about things such as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, Manifest Destiny, the uptick in the issue of slavery and abolitionism throughout the country. And as we know, all of these things kind of form together to help lead to the Civil War. Civil War largely fought over the slavery issue after the secession of the Southern states, and there's a lot of issues that are rolled into the Civil War. A lot of different things kind of snowballed and built up until we had, as Coach Crouch shows in his videos, those balloon that finally pops, and boom, we have the Civil War. But what actually is that defining moment that broke the camel's back? What is going to be that trigger point that once it happens is going to set off the country and send us to this path and directly into the Civil War? Well, today that's what we're going to talk about. Today we're going to talk about the election of 1860, aka the election that Abraham Lincoln is going to eventually win, that is going to cause a Civil War. So we're going to look at the election of 1860, how it happened and its outcomes, and then the immediate aftermath of that that's going to lead to 7 different states leaving the Union, and the first acts of war for the Civil War in the shelling of Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April of 1861. All right, so let's begin. All right, so in quick review, we've had the Missouri Compromise, which kept the slavery out of the northern territories above that line that borders Arkansas and Missouri, our top border, the 3630 line, and said that slavery could not be north of that. And it also set precedent to say that we have to admit a slave state to the Union and a free state to the Union at the same time to keep that balance in Congress, so everybody's interests are being upheld and they can't just kind of vote out slavery. Well, that's going to be good. And then we have the Compromise of 1850, which strengthens that fugitive slave law and introduces this idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty championed by Mr. Stephen Douglas. This is the people's will in the rights of slavery and in the choice to be a slave state or not a slave state. This is going to be further implanted in the United States consciousness with the passage of the Kansas and Nebraska Act. Now, the Kansas and Nebraska Act is the name kind of says it all. It's about Kansas and Nebraska and how they are going to be admitted into the Union as slave states or free states. And it's kind of ironic because I believe Kansas doesn't actually become a state until after the Civil War breaks out. But what the Kansas and Nebraska Act does is it completely gets rid of the Compromise of 1820, that Missouri Compromise. That's no longer a thing. It does not matter. It does not exist. Who cares? And it establishes popular sovereignty as the way to decide the future. Now, Stephen Douglas thought this was a great idea. He thought, well, if we take the politics out of this, if we leave it for the people in each of these states who live there to choose whether they want slavery or not, then it can't be an issue because it's just within those states. We're not going to disrupt any of the things in these other states, but these new ones, we're going to let them and those people decide what is best for their needs in their state in terms of slavery. Now, from Coach Staggs' video last week, we know this is going to blow up big time because of Mr. John Brown. Now, John Brown, he liked to kill people. And he liked to kill people with righteous purpose of getting rid of slavery. He's going to, the Potawatomi Massacre, and he's going to really be that person that lends the name, the blood, to Bleeding Kansas. The Potawatomi Massacre, he is going to massacre a bunch of slaveholders with a freaking broadsword. Just chop them up. Doesn't even go to jail for it. Or, I mean, he might go to jail for a little bit, but, he got back out. Obviously, he got back out enough time to take hold of an entire armory at Harper's Ferry to try to arm slaves during revolt. Now, John Brown can be seen as both good or bad. It's depending on your point of view. Now, he did become a martyr, and there's a song named after him that the Union Army marched to. And then the Southerners obviously did not like him because he was killing the people that owned slaves. And they're like, we own slaves, don't kill us. We don't like people like that. So John Brown happens, and this Bleeding Kansas affair just really kicks up this dust with popular sovereignty. And the opponents of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and of popular sovereignty are going to form a new political party, the Republican Party. Same Republican Party that's with us today. This is the roots. This is the foundation. This is where it comes from. It comes from the opposition of the Kansas and Nebraska Act. Now, so we'll have a new political party. Well, now we'll have the Republicans versus the Democrats, and it's going to be this way throughout the rest of American history up until this point. This is kind of that jumping off point. So moving forward from that, you have the whole Lincoln-Douglas debates introducing Abraham Lincoln to the stage of America through the press and the circulation of newspapers and copies of the speeches and the debates that get passed around, and Lincoln becomes a big figure. And this is going to all come together to set the stage for the election of 1860. All right, so as we enter the election of 1860, I want to first take a moment to kind of well, she's grumpy. Anyway, I'd like to take a moment to kind of point out and talk about how elections in our country work. So we get to vote. We get to vote on who we want to have lead the country. Now, there's two types of votes. There's the popular vote, which is the legitimate number of votes that a candidate gets. And then there is the electoral college. Now, the popular vote is usually an indicator of how the the election is going to come out. But the true deciding factor is how many delegates you get within the electoral college. All right, so what you should be seeing is a map of the United States with a bunch of numbers on it. Now, these numbers represent the amount of representatives that each state has. This is based on their total population. Now, when we go and we vote for president, we end up voting for these electors to vote for the president. So we vote for somebody to cast our vote for us. Now, when a state such as Arkansas, if a presidential candidate wins the Arkansas popular vote, they get those 6 electors. So those 6 electors go towards building them a total, and that total is what determines who is going to be president or not. You have to have a majority to get the job. You have to have a majority to get elected. Now, this is modern times. In the 1860s, it's going to look a bit different. I'll put a map up of that here shortly. All right, now as you noticed on that little intro thing, it said election of 1860, that thingy that I put on there. There was 4 names: Lincoln, Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell. Now, the election of 1860 is going to have 4 different main candidates. I know we're typically accustomed to having 2 big ones, like the most recent election, Trump versus Clinton. But this is one of those weird cases where there is going to be actually 4 candidates that receive a pretty significant chunk, upwards of 7, 8, 9% of the popular vote, and they're all going to win delegates. Now, these 4 different candidates are going to represent 3 different political parties. We're going to have the Republicans by Mr. Abraham Lincoln. We're going to have the Northern Democrats with Stephen Douglas, the Southern Democrats with John C. Breckinridge, and the Constitutional Union Party with Mr. John Bell. Now, Constitutional Union Party, they're basically the people who didn't want to vote for the other 3 guys. So these are going to be our 4 candidates moving forward into the election. Now, the big thing with this election is you have a split in the Democratic Party. Anytime in history, a party splits, that means divides into two sides, they're going to lose the election. It happens every time this occurs. This happens. It's how Andrew Jackson got elected president, because the Jeffersonian Republicans split. It walks the Jacksonian Democrats. So here we have the Democrat split, which is going to lead to a Republican victory. Now, of the four candidates, I want to spend a couple of seconds to talk about like the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. So normally you have a convention, and they pick a candidate. They set a platform. This is their ideas. This is what they're going to campaign on, and then they pick a president. Well, at the Democratic convention, basically everybody from the South kind of went. They walked out, and that was the end of it. They put up their own candidate for presidency, and the actual party itself put up Stephen Douglas, where the Southern Democrats put up Breckinridge. Now, the weird thing was that the sitting president, Buchanan, endorsed the Southern Democratic candidate, but not the actual Democrat candidate. So this is going to be a mess, essentially, for the Democratic Party. And like I said, you've got John Bell, who is everybody else. You know, they didn't want to vote for Lincoln. They didn't want to vote for either of the Democrats, so they voted for John Bell in the Constitutional Union Party. It's going to cause a very interesting election because no candidate, none of them, are going to receive over 40% of the popular vote in the country. That's how divided this election is. Now, Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, did not run on a platform that said, I want to get rid of slavery. That would have been stupid. He would have never gotten the votes he got. Lincoln's entire idea was, I don't want to expand slavery. I'm not going to mess with it in the South. And they have it, they can keep it. But we're not going to move it. We're not going to keep it going into these new territories. You had Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat. He was all about popular sovereignty. He is the guy who, with the Kansas Nebraska Act, he was about popular sovereignty. And then you have John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democratic candidate, who, he's Southerner, pro-slavery, 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 do whatever you can to defend and expand slavery. That's kind of John Breckinridge's deal. And Bell, well, he didn't say anything about slavery in his platform. His goal was avoid the issue. Maybe I get some votes if I just avoid the issue. Now, all this is going to happen, and we're going to see some very interesting election results. Here's the map. All right, so Abraham Lincoln is going to win the North. John C. Breckinridge is going to win the South. You're going to have Bell win a few of those border states in Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia. And Douglas, well, he's going to get Missouri. But the beauty of this map is if the Democrats were able to run behind one candidate, they would have picked up those votes from Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Missouri and would have made it almost a deadlocked race for president. But because the party splits, Lincoln just simply winning the North gives him the election of 1860, and he is going to go on to become the next president of the United States. All right, so with the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln becomes president, and we are going to immediately see the first wave of secession from the United States. Secession meaning to break politically from another entity. They're leaving the Union of States that is bound by the Constitution. These states are going to leave. Now, Abraham Lincoln really didn't pay much attention to this because he saw the Constitution as a legally binding contract. You can't leave it. But following the lead of South Carolina, where John C. Calhoun, the Mr. I'm going to nullify and get rid of things person is from, they're going to be the first to leave. And if you ever need like kind of an idea of how to remember some of the first few states that are going to leave the Union, look at the first three letters of secession, SEC. So the first 7 states are going to have South Carolina, Mississippi, Texas, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. They're going to go. Bye-bye. Leave the Union. Now, with Lincoln's approach, this is not they can't really do this. It's not really legal. He's going to decide that he's not going to return to those states any federal or government-owned property. Now, these states have military bases in them. And this is going to become a problem with Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter is a military base and armory in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, initially, it shouldn't really have been an issue, but a guy named Major Robert Anderson, he decided to move 2 companies from the fort they were currently stationed at to Fort Sumter without anybody's permission. He just did it. He thought, if the South Carolina militia tries to uprise and like attack and take this fort back, we can't defend it. So he moved 2 companies of his troops to protect Fort Sumter and hopefully kind of build a defense where they're like, hey, there's people here to man these guns and batteries and mortars and all these cannons and stuff. Maybe we shouldn't attack. So it was kind of like a scare tactic. Hey, we actually have troops here, so you probably shouldn't attack this place. And he did this without anybody's knowledge, without any permission. He just did it. And that's going to be a problem because South Carolina is going to want Fort Sumter. It's in Charleston, South Carolina. And they are not going to want to return. So there's going to be kind of this medieval-style siege standoff where you're going to have the troops from the United States Army in Fort Sumter, the militia on the outside. Nobody's budging either way. The people of South Carolina and the South are not letting supplies in, so they're kind of trying to starve out the troops within Fort Sumter. And Lincoln catches wind of this, so in early April of 1861, he decides these people are starving. They're stuck. We can't extract them from this fort because we can't get anybody down. But so I decided to send them food. So he got some cargo ships out and decided, hey, and he let the people of South Carolina know there's no reinforcements in this stuff. This is just, we're sending them food. These are our soldiers. They're hungry. We're going to send them food. And he routed some supply ships for Fort Sumter. South did not believe Lincoln. They did not think it was just food. They thought it was more troops and this was going to be a big mess. So early in the morning of April 11th of 1861, the South Carolina militia began open bombardment on Fort Sumter. These are the very, very first shots of the Civil War. As you kids would say, shots fired. So this is going to happen. It's going to go on for days. The United States troops inside of the armory are going to be very sparingly firing their rounds because they can't get supplied and they only have a limited amount of ammunition and stuff as it is. And eventually, they're going to force the American troops inside to surrender the fort to the South. And this action, barely a month and a half after Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated as president, merely 4 months after his 4 or 5 months? Yes, 4 or 5 months after his actual election, we are now at war. This is the action that leads directly to warfare. And this is what's going to escalate quickly. And next week, we will continue the topic of discussion, and we'll talk a little bit about the fighting, the troops, and the new nature of this war, medical, look at some gross pictures and stuff like that. You guys have a good week.